Well, first of all, I wanted to start by clearing up something that I mentioned last week, and that was the two different ways that Crenshaw and Purdue approach the book. That Crenshaw, James Crenshaw, seems to approach the book from a perspective of, um, well, sort of the traditional approach, right? The book is just cynical about life and everything. And Leo Purdue actually approaches it a little bit different way. And I wanted to show you the differences in the translations because I think it's good to keep in mind because I want to look at chapter 9, which by most accounts is probably the most depressing of the whole the whole book, and sort of to keep in mind these two different approaches as we look at it. So, as I say, Crenshaw's is the book is a reflection of the futility of life, which is pretty much the traditional. Purdue sees the book as a reflection on the pursuit for meaning in a fleeting life. In other words, life is so brief that it where do you find meaning in this brief and fleeting life? So for the traditional, all is vanity and a chasing of the wind, that's a traditional translation, which Crenshaw would go with. Purdue translates it, all is breath, quickly passing, and a desire to retain life's animating spirit. So for him, it is he's basically trying to capture what he sees as the idiom of that all life is transitory and ephemeral, and that where do you find meaning in pursuing holding on to ruach, which is the same word here, wind. Ruach is spirit, wind, breath, all those are the same. He's translating this word hevel as breath, which is also another word for breath or wind or vapor, usually is what it's normally thought of as, just a nothing kind of idea. So, but I think it's a slightly different focus, which makes you read the text a little differently, right? Is this book saying, where do you find meaning because life is so brief? Or is the book saying there is no meaning and life is brief? So either of those is possible. We will move on. Here's chapter 9. As I said, probably the more depressing of the chapters, if not the most. All this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God, whether it's love or hate, one doesn't know. Everything that confronts them is vanity, since the same fate comes to all. So, in other words, the righteous and the wise have their deeds in the hand of God, and they're going to die. To the righteous and the wicked, to the good, to the evil, to the clean, to the unclean, to those who sacrifice and those who do not sacrifice, as are the good, so are with the sinners. Those who swear are like those who shun an oath. This is an evil in all that happens under the sun, that the same fate comes to everyone. Moreover, the hearts of all are full of evil. Madness is in their hearts while they live. And after that, they go to the dead. But whoever is joined with all the living has hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. So, other words, that first of all, it's terribly unfair that everybody dies. I mean, you would like to think that something gave you some advantage in this world, right? Wisdom, foolishness, righteous, unrighteous, rich, poor, everybody dies. But better to be alive than dead. Right? A living dog. By the way, dog's not really, that's not a particularly positive image. Um, the, we was like, oh, sure, living dogs are good. No, dogs were pretty much, sort of feral animals. They weren't. I mean, they were domesticated, but they weren't house pets, and thought of sort of negatively. The one exception I think I mentioned before, the one exception of this is Zoroastrianism in the Middle East really approved of dogs. They saw that faith. Their faith saw dogs as a wholly good creature, but most saw dogs. That's sort of a negative statement. Like we probably should think coyotes when we read that, something like that. That it sort of has a wild sense to it. So like when Jezebel is eaten by dogs, um, it's a negative. I mean, first of all, it's a negative to do that, but it's not just that she was eaten by dogs, which is not a positive thing. It is also that she was eaten by dogs, which is really not a positive thing at the end of the day. So anyway, let's see. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, and even the memory of them is lost. Their love and their hate, their envy already perish. Never again will they have any share in all that has happened under the sun. So this text is coming at a time when everyone goes to Sheol. Sheol is the grave, and so this is it's a accepted understanding that there is no way for God to make any balancing of the scales after death, and there is no balancing of the scales before death. So that's what Qoheleth is wrestling with. That this isn't fair. There's nothing that gives you an edge. There's nothing. It's better to be alive than dead, but don't know what to do. Ecclesiastes says, go, eat your bread with enjoyment, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Let your garments always be white. Do not let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that are given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. Make hay while the sun shines is basically what all that says, and try to enjoy it as you will. Now, from Crenshaw's perspective, that has a sort of fatalistic, well, it's all you got. Enjoy the food, enjoy the drink, enjoy the time with your family. Then you go to Sheol and you don't have any of that. As opposed to, say, Purdue's approach, which is enjoy that while that is something that provides meaning in this brief life, is food and drink and family and work. That it is a way to find meaning, if you will, in that time, which is a possible reading of this. I don't know if I'm convinced, but it's a possible, because this comes off as pretty negative to me. So, well, much like Proverbs, at times Qoheleth seems to have some very serious contradictions in his argument, and how you deal with these contradictions is a little bit problematic. One possible explanation is that the author is quoting his critics and then dealing with their arguments. This is not uncommon, and it would not be out of the realm of even the biblical text. It is generally accepted in 1 Corinthians that Paul, after he says in 1 Corinthians, now on to the matters about which you wrote, has several moments where he is quoting what the Corinthians wrote him, and then going on to answer, sort of correct the bad theology in the things that were in their letter. So, unfortunately, there were no quotation marks in the early manuscripts, and as a result, it is up to the text critic to figure out what is the quotation from the church and what is Paul. And so that does lead to kind of a problem. And critics of this approach would say that the quotations, there are ways to say you're quoting, right? You can say, people will say, or scholars say, or the sages have always believed. That's all you got to do, right? And then people know you're quoting. Is it possible that the things that he is quoting are common enough proverbs that it's clear to everyone that he's quoting? Well, maybe, but unfortunately we miss that. Let me show you an example of a contradiction first. I'm trying to remember, I think this is chapter 8. Though sinners do evil 100 times and prolong their lives, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they stand in fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will they prolong their days like a shadow, because they do not stand in fear before God. So, good, okay. Righteous people do well, wicked people don't. Next verse, there is a vanity that takes place on the earth, that there are righteous people who are treated according to the conduct of the wicked, and there are wicked people who are treated according to the conduct of the righteous. I said that this is also vanity. Well, that is exactly the opposite of what he just said. So, is this a quotation that everyone is aware of? Is this the argument that they get? And then this is the rebuttal? Or what? If it's a quote, I should say, is it a quote? The answer is always yes, if it's a self-contained saying. So if if it seems sort of pithy and proverb-like, if it sounds like Proverbs or the theology you get from Proverbs, if it stands in tension with other things Qoheleth has said, or if it doesn't have the characteristics of late Hebrew. In other words, if I said, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, it's pretty obvious that that's not the way I normally talk. That's obviously coming from someplace else. So if it has a feature of earlier Hebrew, then maybe that's a quote as well. Now, this is all fine, except there are some weaknesses in this idea of it being a quote, being quotes. One, it doesn't allow Qoheleth diversity of thought. And it also makes it very easy for us to just excise things that would be problematic in the reading. So in other words, that's hard to read. Well, it must be a quote. That must be what that is. Maybe not. I am not wholly on board with the quote approach on reading these contradictions. Rather, a rhetorical feature is what we're looking at. In other words, Qoheleth might actually be saying both. The world is complicated, right? And Qoheleth can see that the world is complicated. So sometimes these contradictory things can seem true. And there really is no middle ground. In other words, we can say at the same time, that there's a reckoning for bad behavior in this world. You live, and sooner or later, you're going to get caught. The house always wins. You cannot defy God forever. And then at the same time, say, people just keep succeeding. The wicked just keep succeeding, and there is no reckoning. You can say both of those things, and those are contradictory things at the same time. So that it could be perhaps what we're getting here is that instead of quotation marks, Qoheleth is saying something along the lines of, on the one hand, X, but on the other hand, Y. Not X, actually, in this case. So that, I think, is a better approach to this. It was actually Germans who came up with this approach to begin with, naturally, because it's biblical scholars, and the Germans always do it. So it is sometimes talked about as the Svar aber Aussaga analysis. Hertzberg came up with it in '63. And so Svar, it's granted, but it's basically what we're trying to say here. So granted, this verse, these verses, and these are examples of the contradictions that we have, right? That we have the granted and then the contradiction on the other side. There's one that's swapped where the granted comes in 11 to 12 and the but comes first. So that, I don't know if that helps us or hurts the argument in that regard. But these are just a list of some places where you can see the contradictions in Ecclesiastes. And so trying to find a way to explain that, I think, is a helpful way of reading it, because otherwise Qoheleth just seems, I don't know, confused on some level, or he just keeps saying contradictory things as he goes through. I've always felt like this was a helpful analysis. And I also, for me, I've always found it compelling to say life is complicated, and that Qoheleth seems to be so good at observing the world. I have no problem with him making the sort of orthodox observation that he has been taught and that sometimes seems to work, that Proverbs is based on, and then call into doubt that same issue in the next verse. But that's not what I've seen, right? I was told this, but I've seen that. Ecclesiastes was likely a part of the Jewish scripture at the time of Jesus. Yes. It was part of this. In fact, even in the case of, like, say, Jamnia, where Ecclesiastes' canonical status was under attack, it was always, the question they were asking was always, how is this canonical? Not, is it canonical? They were not determining whether they had already kind of come to accept, okay, this is part of the canon, and I can't figure out why. That seems to sort of be the general rabbinical approach to this book. So yeah, I mean, I would argue that pretty much the canon by the time of Jesus, but canon by the time of the New Testament is bigger, not smaller. So in other words, you would not say, was it canonical by the time of Jesus? You probably say, what else was canonical by the time of Jesus? I mean, it's possible that Maccabees was thought of as scripture in the time of Jesus, and it was only taken out later. After that, it certainly became canonical for the early Christians. So yeah, everything we've got was pretty much canonical. The question is, what else was canonical at that point? Here's another interesting example, I think, of the Zvar Arber Asaga. Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work comes from one person's envy of another. This also is vanity and a chasing after the wind. Now here's the contradiction. Fools fold their hands and consume their own flesh. In other words, you lazy bunch of folks are going to just die. If you're lazy, you're dead. Because you fold your hands, you're going to starve to death and die. And then comes the next verse. Better is a handful with quiet than two handfuls with toil and a chasing after the wind. So, okay, yeah, lazy folks are going to die, but it's sure a whole lot better not to work yourself to death. It's better to find work-life balance. This is the work-life balance verse here in Ecclesiastes. And then you see, that's just one verse 6. Yeah. No, the first one is lazy folks are just lazy folks are just lazy and they're going to die. And say, yeah, well, maybe, but but I saw the vanity under the sun, the case of solitary individuals without sons or brothers, yet there's no end to all their toil, and their eyes are never satisfied with riches. For whom am I toiling, they ask, and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity. So the overworking is dumb. So so on the one hand, this looks like you need to work because lazy people are going to die. On the other hand, it's but not too hard, right? Not obsessively. Don't let it consume who you are. This is the self-care verse of Ecclesiastes right here. Better is a handful with quiet than 2 handfuls with toil. Let's look at the very end of Qoheleth here. This is how it all ends. Besides being wise, the teacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs. Interesting that we've moved to the third person now. So either Qoheleth played in the NBA, Qoheleth was very wise and taught many proverbs, or we're getting sort of an editorial ending that we've added here, possibly. The teacher sought to find pleasing words and wrote words of truth plainly. The sayings of the wise are like goads, sticks that poke animal goads. You know, you goad someone, you goad your mother all the time, just so you know, even though you don't have the word for it. That's what you're doing.
And I'm proud.
Yeah, right. A cattle prod is a goad, if you will. It's a stick. Like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Thomas, here's your college student's verse. This is your life verse. Are you ready? Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh.
Amen.
Yeah, see, I told you that's a college student life verse there. And then we come to the very end, the last verse of Proverbs 12:13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So that's the thesis that you're supposed to get when you read the book of Proverbs. Really? Is that what we've gotten up to now? Maybe. I'm gonna come back to say yes later, but it is absolutely the case that this is probably fair to say, it is probably the consensus opinion of scholars. Now, it is probably the majority. There's no such thing as a consensus opinion of scholars. It is probably the majority opinion of scholars, at least a plurality, that believe that this 13 and 14 were added later. That this editorial section, when we start going Qoheleth third person, is an addition to the text to sort of shoehorn Qoheleth into a more canonical lane, to make Qoheleth sound a little more like he belongs in the Bible than do whatever your heart desires, which is what he says, even though God said in Numbers 21, don't do whatever your heart desires. So, I mean, Qoheleth literally is arguing with Torah at times. And so people are like, okay, it's canonical, but can we add a verse to make it a little, can you give us something? And so that most scholars believe this is probably added. I don't necessarily go that far. I think it is possible to read this section as faithful to the rest of the text of Qoheleth. I mean, for no other reason, we've seen this a little before already. I mean, I showed you in chapter 8 where fearing God and righteousness, that's expressed as something that Qoheleth respected and honored. So this is not the first time we see fear God in this book. We see it in chapter 3, chapter 8, chapter 6. It is in there. So I'm not one to say it's not. Now, it doesn't bother me if it was added, but I don't know that you have to go there. Mm-hmm. Are there any examples of other texts like Ecclesiastes? I showed you some like Proverbs, and we're going to see there's one like Job, but are there any like Ecclesiastes as a wisdom text? Well, there are a couple of examples, maybe. It is a little bit unique. Cynical wisdom does seem to be a little less popular than practical wisdom. The penny saved is a penny earned seems to resonate better with people than, you know what, you're going to die and life is meaningless. That doesn't quite seem to sell quite as much. But they're, I know, shocking. there are several Egyptian examples of long dead rulers having speaking wisdom to later generations in later times. In other words, people writing under an assumed dead ruler. No, it's not. They found them. It's do not open for 1,000 exactly till 2100 BC. Yeah, no. Who's Christ? I don't know. What's BC mean? Before Christ? Who's Christ? Beats me. No, the Egyptian. Someone is writing under an assumed ruler later on to give their writing authority. Yeah, exactly. And so that's what I suggested that probably Qoheleth is doing, since there are some things that seem to show it's a much later text. They're writing. So there is at least the example of that. Now, the content was very different, but that was at least done. There is an Egyptian book called The Songs of the Harper. I don't know what the harper is. I probably should. You think?
I imagine so. If it's a song. Songs of the guy that plays the harp.
You know what? Really it's so obvious. It really does. It never even occurred to me. I know you. Well, the two musicians. You know what happened? The first thing I thought was the hooper, and so I thought the guy that made barrels. Oh no, wait, that's not a hoop. That's the harper. A hooper's a guy who makes barrels. Well, why does sea shanties a thing?
I was actually about to say sea shanties.
Sailors have songs. When you have repetitive work, you often sing songs to make it go better. But it's not a hooper. It's a harper, which you think means the guy played the harp. You know, he might. It never occurred to me.
Songs of the guy who composed songs on the harp.
Anyway, I don't know if that's true or not, but maybe it is. It could just be. I didn't know what a harper was. Anyway, it dates to about 2100, and it questions the afterlife and encourages enjoying the present. Right? That don't know what happens when you die, so make the most of it while you can. That has a little bit of resonance with Ecclesiastes. The Mesopotamian dialogue of pessimism.
That's quite a title.
It's rough, man. It's the worst. It really is. Because it's 1200 BC. This nobleman and this slave are having a conversation. And the nobleman says, you know what? I think...
Is this set up to a joke?
It is not. Well, no. The nobleman says, I think I'm going to do this. So the slave quotes a proverb that says the benefits of doing that. And then the nobleman says, you know what? I don't think I'm going to do that. And then the slave quotes the proverbs about the bad things that happen when people do that. So these two contradictory things. And then the slave has this existential crisis when he realizes that he had two proverbs at the ready that said opposite things. And so he commits suicide. I know. It is like it takes this terribly dark turn in this dialogue of pessimism. Surprise ending, but it does. It absolutely. I remember when I was reading about it, I went, "Oh my gosh!" I thought, he went off to, find an honest man or something, but no, he just decided life is simply.
That's the beginning of a hero's journey.
No, exactly. That's what I thought. It's the beginning of the wisdom equivalent of a hero's journey.
It's not like there hasn't been one in Mesopotamia.
Exactly. They've already done that before in Hero's Journey in Mesopotamia. This guy decided to go a totally different direction, and he killed himself because of contradictory proverbs. It shouldn't be that serious. That's another misuse of wisdom literature. I'm just going to go ahead and say it right now. Yeah. Nobody saw that coming. It's like M. Night Shyamalan directed the dialogue of exactly. Who does that? I had these two contradictory proverbs. I'm just going to kill myself. Wow. So that's kind of dark, I guess, like Ecclesiastes. I just felt I should mention. One question that I wanted to ask is just how uncanonical is Qoheleth, right? Because we were talking about, was that we okay?
Yeah, I just thought,
how uncanonical is it? I mean, it's canonical, but how uncanonical is it? These things it says. Well, there is one God, creator of all, and God is transcendent and sovereign, and humans were created out of dust, and humans are animated by ruach, by breath. The world is created good. Human beings, by their own choice, became corrupted, and as a result, the world is full of evil, hardship, and injustice. This is all right in line. I mean, he seems to buy a lot of this. Um, and there are several examples where he echoes other parts of the canon. You are to dust, and dust you shall return. Fitting, since next Wednesday night we are doing a Ash Wednesday service, so always good to remember that. He says the dust returns to the earth as it was. Deuteronomy, you must neither add anything to what I command or take anything away from it. You must diligently observe everything I command. Ecclesiastes 3:14, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it nor taken away from it. Another good one. If you make a vow, don't postpone fulfilling it. Ecclesiastes, when you make a vow to God, don't delay fulfilling it. 1 Samuel, surely to obey is better than sacrifice. Ecclesiastes 5, to draw near and listen is better than sacrifice offered by fools. This listen could also be obey. 1 Kings 8, there is no one who does not sin. Ecclesiastes 7, surely there is no one on earth so righteous as to do good without ever sinning. So very canonical. But then there's other places, as I pointed out, where he says, do what your heart desires, which Numbers 14 says, don't do that. So it is at least in tension with some other things that are going on. One thing that's interesting is interpretation of meaning. Michael Fox, not Michael J. Fox. This is Michael. This is middle initial. I think it's V. Michael V. Fox. Anyway, he quotes Viktor Frankl and says that life is made meaningful in three ways: through what we give back to the world by our works, by what we take from it in our experience, and through our response to what we cannot change. That those are the three things. What's that? He does logotherapy. Making meaning. Interesting. Well, Fox says that Qoheleth only focuses on the last two. This was your criticism last week, is that Qoheleth is only focusing on what we take from it from our experience and our response to what we cannot change. And in those two things, there is this world is hard to find meaning in, but he completely neglects what we give to it by our works as a way of finding meaning, which is what you were criticizing last week. He also points out that there are presuppositions in Qoheleth about meaning. So for Qoheleth, meaning is found when actions have an appropriate consequence. And for Qoheleth, he has certain beliefs about what make an appropriate consequence. It has to be an immediate consequence. It has to apply to the one performing the action. It must be publicly visible. It must occur consistently, and it must not be lost to time. So if all of those things happen, then it is an appropriate consequence and therefore can provide meaning. And we might take issue with some of those things. We might argue that
publicly visible part is
exactly that meaning might not be seen. It might not necessarily endure. It might be helping other people as opposed to self, and that might be a selfless act might provide meaning. So that there are limits on how far we can take Qoheleth with providing meaning as we go. Okay, I wanted to come back to the end of the matter, and this is kind of coming back to the issue of where he was limiting meaning and his definition for meaning. I think the end here, if we accept this end as representative of the book, and this is why this is sort of important for me. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. I think that it is completely in keeping with the rest of the book of Qoheleth for Qoheleth to say, fear God, because that's what you're supposed to do, which is what he says. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. But there's no promise that this gives you any sense of control over life or explanation for how life works. It is what you are to do. Fear God. God is God. You are not God. Live as though that is the case. And leave what God will do with that to God. And we're going to talk about this more explicitly when we get into Job, because I think Job brings out what I'm expressing now more explicitly, and that is what we call disinterested piety. To be faithful when there's nothing in it for you, to be obedient when you're not rewarded for it, if you will. Man of La Mancha, exactly. It's the impossible dream all over again, right? And so this disinterested piety, this I believe is an expression of disinterested piety. You fear God, you keep his commandments, because that is what you should do. But don't believe, like Proverbs, that it will make life make sense, that you will be able to control the way in which life works, that you can guarantee success or riches or anything. That at the end of the day, the good and the fool, the wise and the fool both die, he says. But that doesn't, I would argue that Qoheleth believes that doesn't change the calling of humanity to say that God is God and human beings are not God. So I find this ending more in keeping with the book than a lot of people do, personally.